Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Beyond Good and Evil. So, did I mention that Nietzsche is not a Democrat? If you're curious about his true feelings about the masses and the crowds and democracy, well, not that we were very confused by the time we hit section 27, but boy, it just gets worse and worse. So, but several very important points raised here in various ways. And even though this seems weirdly divided, I think by the time we finish, I'll do 27, 28, 29, 30, because they do sort of form a group. They're kind of facets of the same argument in a way. So he starts with, it is difficult to be understood, especially when one thinks and lives Ganges Rotukati, like the Ganges River. So, imagine a massive, sprawling, slow-moving, religious, spiritual being that is the Ganges. And when everybody else is either a frog or a turtle. This is his comparison, like a tortoise or like a frog. And one should be hardly grateful for the goodwill to some refinement of interpretation. So again, he's saying his mode of life, of course, it's him, who is living like a river. He's this huge, slow-moving, powerful, spiritual, epic being. And he's surrounded by the slow and small, who see the river from the outside, and the fast and small, who see the river from the outside. Right, so there's no real a frog does not comprehend the Ganges. A tortoise does not comprehend the Ganges. And so he says, so it's very difficult for people to understand him because he's just coming at the world from such a different place, which is in fact true. Now, I don't know if this makes other people turtles and frogs, but certainly he was coming from such a wildly different outlook that, as we've discovered, as we were experiencing, that, no wonder it was difficult for him to be understood. And if you read his letters or read his biographies, what you'll find is he felt very lonely. So he had some friends, and he tried to be a good friend, and he would send his works out, and they just could not figure out what he was on about. I mean, he was so challenging in his time. I think he's still challenging today, but in his time, it was just... it was just hard to appreciate or understand what he was driving at or why he would write like this, why he would do this. And so he says, as regards the good friends, however, who are always too easygoing and think that as friends they have a right to ease, one does well at first to grant them a playground and a romping place for misunderstanding. One can thus laugh still, or get rid of them altogether, these good friends, and laugh then also. So make yourself open to misunderstanding and miscommunication, and don't expect that from your quote-unquote good friends, because then you can still enjoy them. If you're expecting them to understand you, then it's just going to be brutal. It's going to be you're going to be disappointed continuously, or decide to get rid of them and laugh about that as well. So notice the choices here: to be misunderstood and enjoy it with your friends, or to be misunderstood and enjoy it without your friends. These are the choices Nietzsche is giving you. And then section 28, he makes this, it's a great argument, and I think it's little appreciated because particularly in the age of AI translation, people are like, oh, well, we can translate everything instantly. It's doing a good job. And there's all these arguments that people keep saying, oh, no, you can translate anything from any language in any language, which is nonsense, as Nietzsche is quick to point out here. And again, one of the great translators, philologists of his age. And he's like, you can't get, and here he uses the word tempo, but I don't think he means just tempo. The pacing, the phrasing, the alliterations, the tone. So much of a language is not the meaning of individual words. It is the nuances and the speed that, again, the tempo, the pacing of the language itself that becomes uncapturable, simply because other languages are structured differently. And so you speak differently. He says a German is almost incapacitated for presto in his language. So notice that. He's incapacitated for presto. So the language is so not presto The words are so long, the phrases are so long, the extended adjectival constructions are so maddening that you can't do the quick, the staccato, the fast-paced speaking. And so even if you did it in German, it wouldn't be heard, it wouldn't be received well, because this is not within the nuances of the language. And he says, when you're looking at the classic Greeks or the classic Romans, just as the buffoon and the satyr are foreign to him in body and conscience, so Aristophanes and Petronius are untranslatable for him. Everything ponderous, viscous, and pompously clumsy, all long-winded and wearying species of style, are developed in profuse variety among Germans. Pardon me for stating the fact that even Goethe's prose, in its mixture of stiffness and elegance, is no exception. Right? So this, because Goethe, good taste, like, and Goethe is, of course, held up, along with Nietzsche, by the way, as an models of German prose. Like, Goethe is the great German writer, or one of the great German writers. You win the Goethe Prize for good German writing, right? So he's sort of iconically good. And he says, I'm not even going to keep Goethe from this criticism. Like, everybody in the German language suffers from this difficulty. And when you suffer from this difficulty, it's not just that you're losing something in translation, it's that you're losing everything. You're losing Aristophanes and Petronius. And why this matters and why this has anything to do with what he's talking about is Nietzsche, because he has access to the original languages and feels that he can feel that difference, is one of the reasons he feels like a river. It's so hard to be understood when even other classical scholars or people who've read all the classics in German and say, oh, I know what Aristophanes is about. I know what Petronius is about. And he's like, no, you absolutely do not understand what they're about, because while you've got the words right, you have the tempo wrong. That's why poetry is virtually impossible to translate, because there's so much that's lost in a language when you try and translate poetry. And so he's like, you just cannot carry this on. There's no way for the average person to understand or maintain this. And so even amongst his friends who are classical scholars or have been reading the classics, they don't have it. And this is a further alienation. And he says, to understand anything, he says, Aristophanes, that transfiguring complementary genius for whose sake one pardons all Hellenism for having existed, provided one has understood it in its full profundity, all that there requires pardon and transfiguration. There is nothing that has caused me to meditate more on Plato's secrecy and sphinx-like nature than the happily preserved petite fait that under the pillow of his deathbed there was found no Bible, nor anything Egyptian, Pythagorean, or Platonic, but a book of Aristophanes. How could even Plato have endured life, a Greek life which he repudiated without Aristophanes? And this is important for several reasons. One, because Aristophanes makes fun of Socrates and Plato functionally. He's, in the Clouds, amongst other places, he just ridicules Socrates, who was, Plato's great master. And so in theory, Plato is no friend to Aristophanes. And Aristophanes' humor is so transcendent in a way. It's just, I'm a huge Aristophanes fan. I did a whole thing on Forgotten Philosophers in which I included Aristophanes because I'm such a great fan, and no one ever thinks of him as a great thinker, but I think he was. And I argue that he is. But part of his great thinking is the humor, is the lightness, is the joy, is the joie de vivre. And he says that element that you get not just in his structure or in the plots of his plays or in the funny one-liners, but in the very way that he deploys language, the way he uses it. That is what makes him so great. And that's the antidote to all the heaviness and all the wrongness that Nietzsche finds in the Hellenistic world. And it's important to know that one of the reasons philologists are so important is because the classical world is viewed as the apogee of what humans can achieve. Like, this is the culture we should be shooting for. And here's Nietzsche standing there saying, not only is that perhaps a wrong idea, which, as we've seen before, he's already said it's a wrong idea, but not only is it perhaps a wrong idea, you don't even understand the culture that you are holding up as the iconic ideal culture. because you cannot access it. And so this is why he feels like he's the Ganges. He feels like he has access to this. He feels like he's this grand, huge, powerful being, and he just can't communicate because there's so many barriers besides his attempt to overcome morality, his critique of Christianity, but it also includes a powerful critique of the classical world as it was received in Germany at the time. And he's going, look, you just do not understand what you're reading. And of course, Aristophanes is the guy you don't want to read. Even today, his plays are difficult to perform, many of them, because they're, one, so embedded in the culture at the time, but also like the Lysistrata or Lysistrata is so fundamentally X-rated. I mean, beyond X-rated. It's just ribald to the ultimate degree the entire time, and yet it's quite powerful and profound the entire time. And that mix is just really hard to carry across the boundary. And if we struggled with it today, let me tell you, in Nietzsche's Germany, when, a very, very conservative society, there was no chance. Like Aristophanes just were like, and we're not going to do this. It was so ribald because it comes from a different tradition, the sadder tradition of Greek craziness. And so it just really did not resonate at all with the German world. And so they were picking and choosing the parts that they liked, that they thought they understood, and holding that up. And Nietzsche's just saying, no, you're not even close, right? So even the people that he should have, his good friends, that he should have been able to communicate with, the things he's saying, the way he's arguing them, he's like, look, who did Plato respect? Who did Plato admire? Who was under Plato's pillow when he died? Aristophanes. That's the mode. And that's the mode that you can't capture in German because German society, German language, he argues even, cannot capture this. And so then you get to 29. It is the business of the very few to be independent. It is a privilege of the strong. And whoever attempts it, even with the best right, but without being obliged to do so, proves that he is probably not only strong, but also daring beyond measure. So if you're forced to be different for some reason, that's one thing. That's the few independent who, for some reason, for whatever, something happens in their life, they're forced. But it's even more daring, more amazing when someone chooses it. Like they have the opportunity to go out and do it by choice. That, and of course, Nietzsche is counting himself as this. And he says, this is not, it proves that you're not only strong, but also daring beyond measure. He enters into a labyrinth. He multiplies 1,000-fold the dangers which life in itself already brings with it. Not least of which is that no one can see how and where he loses his way, becomes isolated and torn piecemeal by some minotaur of conscience. So if you're doing what other people are doing it, in the way other people are doing it, you can tell when you're doing it right and when you're doing it wrong because you're doing the same thing. If you're independent, outside people can't tell. They can't help. There's no roadmap. The way that is a way is no way, right? Like it's right there in Taoism. There is no clear path, and so you can't tell, and no one can tell you whether you're on the path or whether you've gone off of the path, whether you've wandered. I mean, figures greatly in Book 4 of Thus Spake Zarathustra, where literally you keep getting sidetracked, and that's the danger, is being sidetracked. But it's the weirdest sidetracks of ever, right? Like other people wouldn't consider it becoming sidetracked. But here you can't know, you can't tell, and no one can tell for you because, of course, that is by definition what being independent is. Supposing such a one, the independent one, comes to grief, it is so far from the comprehension of men that they neither feel it nor sympathize with it, and he cannot any longer go back. He cannot even go back against the sympathy of men, right? So you get to this place, again, beyond good and evil, also beyond the sympathy of your fellow man. You just become wildly isolated because they don't understand when you've come to grief. They don't see your problems. They can't empathize with you because you're doing something so radically different. And so you get isolated. And when they do sympathize with you for some reason, that doesn't help either because their sympathy is wrong-headed, right? So you can't be against it because it just is irrelevant. And so you have neither the support of the sympathy nor the advantage of being able to, I don't need your sympathy. It's like, well, your sympathy just doesn't work, right? It's a non-thing for me because I'm in a place where you don't understand my struggles, and so you don't know what to sympathize with or how to sympathize with it. And so you place yourself outside of the common, human culture, right? Functionally, this is what he's arguing is that you do this. You're beyond them. And so, again, this is very isolating. And if you go back to Thus Spake Zarathustra, I mean, he was on a mountain by himself talking to the sun when he decides to go back down, and then he decides that was probably a mistake. And so he wanders off again. He's like, I probably shouldn't have done that, right? So that's the problem. No one understands him. This is something that happens over and over and over again. And one reason Thus Spake Zarathustra is so great is because so many times when I've taught it and talked to people about it is it's hard to understand what Nietzsche's about, not because he isn't clear, because he keeps saying things that run so counter to just our fundamental intuitive sense of what is right and wrong or what is natural and normal, that when you encounter this kind of thinking, you really are put off your paces. You really do go, well, I don't understand what he's saying, which is Nietzsche's whole point here. When I can come and I can talk to you, but it doesn't make any sense to you. It doesn't resonate. And so on 30, our deepest insights must and should appear as follies and under certain circumstances as crimes when they come unauthorizedly to the ears of those who are not disposed and predestined for them. Right. So this raises one of those thorny issues in the history of philosophy. And this is the idea of the exoteric and the esoteric, which he raises, as they were formerly distinguished by philosophers among the Indians, as among the Greeks, Persians, and Muslims. In short, whoever people believed in gradation of rank and not in equality and equal rights. So the question here is, are all messages intended for all ears? And there's the great passage, which I've mentioned in other lectures, because I just think it's so profound, in Confucius, where he walks around with his student and three different people ask Confucius roughly the same question, and he gives them three different answers. And then the student, after these encounters, says, wait a second, right? You just gave contradictory advice. And he said, for this person, this is the right message. For that person, this is the right message. And for that person, this is the right message. Like, not everybody gets the same message. Not everybody can hear the same message, right? Not all messages are translatable across certain barriers. And so should philosophy, should writing, should religions have esoteric ones, which is to say ones that are hidden from most people most of the time? Or do you just put it all out there and whatever gets misunderstood is misunderstood, and then that's the way it is? And that, we're very sensitive to that because we come from a democratic society and we're like, no, everything should be available to everybody all of the time. Or Nietzsche, of course, disagrees with this 100%. He's saying, no. Any society that distinguished people by gradations of rank, the Greeks, Persians, Muslims, they had this distinction. They thought it was important not to give people messages that they just aren't going to understand. And as I said, in contradistinction to one another in respect to the exoteric class, standing without and viewing, estimating, measuring, and judging from the outside and not from the inside. The more essential distinction is that the class in question views things from below upwards, while the esoteric class views things from above downwards. And here is again Nietzsche's profound elitism and his view on this. Is he like, look, the notion that you can say the same thing to everybody and they'll get the message is utterly and contemptibly wrong. And you see this today, by the way, because people go, because politicians have learned the inverse. You have to say things that resonate with people, right? You can't, the notion that you're going to stand up and say, people keep saying, they should tell people, the truth or how it is or what it is. And it's like, well, that's an interesting idea, But this doesn't resonate. What resonates with people is simple phrases like hope and change, right? Hope and change, is Obama's great phrase that he ran on, is, clearly just vacuous. And what does it mean? But it resonated. Now, if he had said something about, long-winded policy decisions, no one would listen, because it's who wants to listen to long-winded policy decisions? But those are the kinds of decisions that have to be made, and they tend to be complicated, hence long, and so they tend to be kept private. And so this is one of those questions. How transparent do people really want their governments to be? Well, Nietzsche is saying not at all. They shouldn't be transparent at all, because you view things from above downward. You're looking down on people. Again, did I mention he was an elitist? You're looking downwards on people, and you have to be able to judge, like, is this someone who can hear? Is this a message that that they can receive? Or is it just going to mess them up? Is it unhealthy? Is it unuseful for them? And he says, there are heights of the soul from which tragedy itself no longer appears to operate tragically. And if all the woe in the world were taken together, who would dare to decide whether the sight of it would necessarily seduce and constrain to sympathy, and thus to a doubling of woe? That which serves the higher class of men for nourishment or refreshment must also almost be a poison to an entirely different and lower order of human beings. There it is. What makes somebody else healthy might poison someone. And in fact, I think this is, I like this argument. I do not like the above-below structuring of it, but this is how he gives it to you. I don't see any reason why this needs to be viewed as an above-below, but this is how Nietzsche sees it, because he's an elitist. He says, the virtues of the common man would perhaps mean vice and weakness in a philosopher. It might be possible for a highly developed man, supposing him to degenerate and to go to ruin, to acquire the qualities thereby alone, for the sake of which he would have to be honored as a saint in the lower world into which he had sunk. There are books which have an inverse value for the soul and the health, according as the inferior soul and the lower vitality, or the higher and more powerful, make use of them. In the former case, they are dangerous, disturbing, unsettling. In the latter case, they are herald calls which summon the bravest to their bravery. Books for the general reader are always ill-smelling books. The odor of the paltry people clings to them. Where the populace eat and drink, even where they reverence, it is accustomed to stink. One should not go into churches if one wishes to breathe pure air. Just as clearly as he could possibly make the statement. Look what's happening. If the books, even books, the messages in books are fit for some ears, not for others, it's just going to confuse them. It actually acts as a poison. Ethics, rules, laws that are fit for some people would actually be damaging, dangerous, unhealth-giving for other people. And so this idea, like, don't go in where the people are. Don't go in with a bunch of people. Remember, we're all, you're supposed to be isolated and alone, because it's always going to stink there. Wherever you get a lot of people together, you're going to get a stench. Don't go into church to pray, right, if you want clean air, because that's not what you get there. And so this continuous contrast between being elevated, being in the mountains, being in clear air, being in clean air, and going down to where it is masses of people are, lots of teeming activity, and lots of stench. He maintains this consistently, not here, but throughout his work, particularly his later work, from about halfway, midway through to the very end, which we're approaching here, by the way, of his life, of his active life, I guess. So every section here, even though they seem very different, reflect the same concept. I am a river, other people are frogs and turtles. Rivers are much greater than frogs and turtles, right? Frogs and turtles have their values, but they are not rivers. And a frog and a turtle cannot understand a river. They should not be expected to be able to understand a river. And notice, this is one of the things he's driving at. It's wrong to expect them to understand this. Part of their confusion, and for Nietzsche's world, this would not be, it'd be much clearer why he makes the next argument about what's not translatable, is if you think you're educated because you've read all these classics in translation and then you sort of prance around as an educated person and think you're going to sit down and communicate with me about the classical world, oh my gosh, have you made a serious error? Because you do not recognize, because you don't have the education that allows you to access the original language with enough clarity and capacity to really appreciate what's going on. I do. You don't. He's actually saying here, I'm reading it correctly and you're reading it incorrectly. So don't be confused. But what he's removing is the capacity of almost any German, even educated German, to have some Latin and maybe some Greek so that they can read some of the classics a little bit. He's like, look, you, because of your German background, because you're translating it into German in your mind, in your soul, you can't even access that. And then you try to talk to me, Mr. Frog. I am the Ganges. I am the great sacred river. You cannot talk to me. You're a frog. And so this does not create unity. This does not elevate the Germans, which is what they argued that it did. By the way, he's being very German here, by the way, because the German said the classics were elevating them. And he's like, no, it's elevating me, but not you, which is also very German at this moment. And so then he rolls this argument on and he says, look, it is a business of very few to be independent. It is the privilege of the strong, right? I am strong. I am daring. I am out there. So it's all these values. Notice he doesn't say he's right. He doesn't say he's truthful. He doesn't say he's accurate. He doesn't say he's good. He says he's strong and daring. Right? Again, this is beyond good and evil. What values are you going to roll out? Let's roll out strong and daring, something that he thinks is important for vitality, which seems reasonable, right? And so again, he reiterates this idea that you are isolated, you are alone, and you can't even be understood by other people because, again, same thing with they can't translate the language. They don't know what's going on. So they can't translate your experiences or what you're doing or your goals. So they don't know what's going on. They can't be that sympathetic for you. And then, of course, the final one, which is the esoteric versus the exoteric, and the notion that, yeah, you should have secret teachings. Secret teachings are necessary and important, or at least teachings that aren't reaching to everybody, because if the weak get them, it's dangerous for them, it's poisonous for them, it's bad for them. But for the strong, they are necessary and good and helpful. And in verse, he says, is also true. Those works, those books, that literature that's really good and uplifting for the masses is itself kind of a poison and can be a poison for the strong, for the independent, for the self-willed. And so what you just get this, 4 chapters or 4-section argument, or argument is not quite right, facets of the same idea, which is Nietzsche is, and people who want to be like Nietzsche should be, isolated, alone, outside, beyond the sympathy of pursuing different paths and different goals, because that is the nature of being strong and daring. And when one really understands the classics, when one really accesses them, this is what happens. You become a Ganges. You become this great being, but in that very greatness, that great achieving the theoretical goal, what you also achieve is utter isolation from everyone else, even from your quote-unquote good friends, which is a carrying on from the idea from earlier, like how do we relate to people? Let them be like music heard over water in the evening. Right. But even that, notice, has that sort of distance. And while beautiful and pleasant and amazing, also over water, it has, again, that space and isolation and sort of resonant spaces outside and distant. So that concept never goes away for Nietzsche, because this is the life he experienced, because he was perceived as being such a nutter, and he did isolate himself quite systematically in his own travels and the way he interacted with people. So, chapters, 27 through 30, I think that was right. Yeah, 27 through 30s, or section 27 through 30 of chapter 2, The Free Spirit. And that's his message about being a free spirit, that this is what it gets you. It sounds great, free spirit, but it's definitely a mixed blessing. And he felt that to an incredible extent. Thank you very much.